Welcome to the Milan location of our 2019-2020 cover crop variety trial. My name is Virginia Sykes. I'm the Variety Testing Coordinator and Agroecology Specialist for the University of Tennessee. And right here you can see one of 3 locations in which we planted a cover crop variety trial this past fall and evaluated it through the spring. This video was taken in late April at our Milan location, and you can see a tremendous amount of variation in performance of those varieties in the test. This trial included 60 different cover crop varieties, including legumes, cereals, and brassicas. And today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the results from that trial. So I'd like to start with a brief overview of cover crops. Cover crops are grown off-season from our cash crops. So in Tennessee, the majority of our row crop systems are in corn and soybeans, which are growing right now in these hot summer months. Therefore, most of our cover crops are going to be cool season annuals. Now, cover cropping offers quite a few benefits for our cash crop systems. Since they are growing during those off seasons, they can reduce erosion and nutrient runoff. They can also help improve the overall soil health by increasing water infiltration and organic matter. Cover crops can provide a financial benefit by reducing the amount of nitrogen that you need to apply to the system, as well as reducing herbicide applications by suppressing those weeds early on in the season. Cover crops can also provide early season foraging for our beneficial insects. Now, all of these benefits are really dependent on growing species and varieties within those species that are regionally adapted. So if you take a look at these 2 pictures on the right, I bet you can guess which one of these is going to provide the most in terms of those cover crop benefits. Now, in the past, there haven't been a whole lot of options when it came to cover crop varieties. If you went looking for a specific species, often it was sold as VNS, or variety not stated. Now, as cover cropping has become more prevalent, we are seeing an expansion in the number of varieties available within some of these species. Now, the best way to figure out whether these varieties and species are well adapted to Tennessee is to trial them in a head-to-head comparison. And so that's what we did this past year. So our trial included 60 different varieties of cover crops. 20 of those fell into that broader group of cereals, 29 of them were legumes, and 11 were brassicas. And then you can see the further breakdown of species within those broader groups. This study was performed in 3 different locations to represent the geographic variability of the state of Tennessee. So we had a location at our East Tennessee Research and Education Center, our Middle Tennessee Research and Education Center, and our Research and Education Center at Milan. This study was designed as a randomized complete block with 3 replications, and those plots were small plots, so 5 to 7 foot by 30 foot long, depending on the drill width. So our Milan location had 7-foot plots. Our Middle Tennessee and East Tennessee locations had 5-foot plots. These plots were drilled, and the depth was dependent on the species. So some of those species have a recommended drilling depth of 1/4 to 1/2 inch, and some have a recommended depth of 1 to 2 inch. So they were planted according to what was appropriate for that species. These were all planted in October of 2019. Originally for this study, we had planned 2 planting dates, but as most of you probably remember, last fall was very droughty and we didn't get any rain until October. So our early planting date was cut and we just had that later planting date in October. Variables that were measured throughout the season were percent cover in November and February, height in November, February, April, and May, biomass in April and May, and then the carbon to nitrogen ratio of that biomass. Now, right now, we're just going to talk about our percent cover and our biomass. The full report for this cover crop variety trial will be available on search.utcrops.com, where our other variety trial information is. So if you want to follow along, there's only so much that you can put in a PowerPoint presentation when you have 60 different varieties that you're comparing. So really, I would recommend, if you want to take a minute, pause this presentation and go download that report so you can follow along or if after this presentation you can go and check that out. All right, so first we're going to talk about biomass. Biomass was measured using a 15 by 15 inch square that was set down randomly in the plot. All of the biomass was cut to 1 inch from the soil surface within that square. That biomass was dried to a constant weight, and then this was performed in April and May. Now, why the two different evaluation dates? Well, again, our row crop systems in Tennessee are primarily corn and soybeans, which have two different planting dates. So if you're growing a cover crop prior to corn, you're probably going to be terminating that in early April. Whereas if you're growing soybeans, you can wait a little later, and early May is probably the latest you're going to be terminating those cover crops. So we wanted to see not only differences in varieties, but also are there differences in what's going to do best before corn, what's going to do best before soybeans. All right, so this is a little busy, and this is actually not all the varieties. This is just varieties that performed well in both April and May. And you can see this ... means that there's more down there that were not our top performers. So again, if you download that PDF of the full report, if you want to see how everything did. So here you can see in the darker orange our top 25%. This lighter orange represents everything that's within that 50th to 75th percentile. And then down here at the bottom, we have the test average, standard error, min, max, and range. So the first thing I'd like you to notice is that here these dark orange, that's our top 25%, they tended to be the same in April and May with a few exceptions. So if it was a great performer in April, it was also a great performer in May for the most part. So that's good because that means that you don't have to pick different varieties depending on whether you're going before corn or before soybeans. If it does well before corn, it's probably also going to do well before soybeans. All right, so breaking that down even further, these are the varieties that did best in both April and May. So top 25% in both of those months. And then you can also break that down further. The cream of the crop are the ones that are in that A group. So you can see these A's here. Those are our mean separation letters. And anything that has an A in it means that it was not significantly different from our top performers. So again, those are the cream of the crop, and those you can see pictures of down here. We had our Bates RS4 cereal rye, AU Merit hairy vetch, NF95319B cereal rye, NF97325 cereal rye, and then a Patagonia Inta hairy vetch. Now, one thing I'd like you to take away from this is that our varieties that were in that top 25% for biomass in both April and May were really dominated by two groups, legumes and cereals. So you won't see any of our brassicas up there in the top 25% for biomass. And then further breaking that down within those groups, really we only saw 3 species: winter pea, hairy vetch, and cereal rye. So now this is the same table with an additional column over there on the right showing the difference in biomass between April and May, as well as the percent increase. And you can see for all of these top performers, we generally doubled to tripled our biomass between those months of April and May. So we saw a pretty clear difference among species for biomass, but what about varieties within those species? Is it important to know what variety you're putting into your cover crop mix? And the short answer is yes, it did make a difference. So here we have our 3 top performing species and the variety within those species. And if you look down at the bottom, you'll see the range. So that's our top performing species minus our bottom performing species. So how much of a difference did it make? Well, if you selected that bottom performing variety of cereal rye as opposed to a top performing variety, you were losing out on 0.8 tons per acre in April and over a ton per acre in May. Now our winter pea and our hairy vetch were a little less extreme. For winter pea in April, that was a 0.2 ton per acre difference, and in May a 0.6 ton per acre difference, and then for hairy vetch in April a 0.5 ton per acre difference, and in May a 0.7 ton per acre difference. So yes, variety selection was very important for maximizing your biomass potential in your cover crop. All right, the next thing we're going to look at is percent cover. Now this was measured in November and then again in February. We wanted to see in November how quickly do these cover crop varieties establish, how quickly are they providing cover, because that's what's going to help us reduce erosion and reduce nutrient runoff. And then we found with some varieties that really in Tennessee it gets a little too cold, particularly in February, so we wanted to see in February how many of those were still providing consistent cover to give us an idea of how they're doing in the winter. We analyzed this by taking 2 square photos per plot during those months and then using Canopio software to digitally analyze the percent green covered. All right, so let's talk about our top performers for percent cover. Now this is set up the same way as our biomass, so our dark orange is the top 25% within the total trial, and then that lighter orange means that it was between the 50th and 75th percentile. So it was above average, but it wasn't up there at the top. Now one thing you'll notice is we see a lot of dark orange here for November cover and a lot of light orange here in the February. So unlike the biomass where our top performers for April were also our top performers for May, that was different for our percent cover. So our varieties that established most quickly in November tended to maintain that percent cover into February, but they weren't necessarily our top performers in February. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that every single one in that top 25% is a cereal. So our cereals were really the quickest to establish and provide immediate cover. And then you can see this picture from February. They really maintained that same amount of cover, but didn't expand on that. So who were our top performers in February? Well, that was dominated by the legumes, and then we have one lone Brassica in here. So our February top 25% are all legumes. Now over here you'll see this picture from our AU Merit Hairy Vetch in November, so you can see that unlike the cereals, they did not establish very quickly. In November, a month after planting, they were only at 3 to 7% cover. We have our lone Brassica there, was at 14% in November. But by the time we got to February, they had almost completely covered those plots. So between 50 to 75% cover, much more than the cereals. So really this highlights the importance of trying to find varieties of both cereals and legumes for a cover crop mix so that you're maximizing both of those benefits, the early season cover from the cereal and then the expanded coverage in those winter months from those legumes. Now, did we see variety differences for percent cover? Here, not so much really with our cereals. You can see the range was only 13% in November and then mere 4% in February. The opposite was seen for our legumes. So here we had the smaller difference in our November rating, so only a 2% difference between that top and bottom performing variety, and then a little bit broader for our February cover, so up to a 15% difference. Hairy Vetch was really where we saw the most variety differences in percent cover. So in November, again, not so much of a difference in our top and bottom performing variety, but by the time you got to February, there was a fairly significant difference here. So our bottom performer with only 40% cover in February compared to our AU Merit, which had 75% cover. So our top performing species did differ in terms of the varieties as much as 35%. So we haven't really talked much about brassicas, and that's because they weren't in the top 25% for biomass in either month, and for the most part they weren't in the top 25% for percent cover. So I would say the take home here is you're probably not going to want to plant monoculture brassica species as a cover crop in Tennessee, because you're really not going to be maximizing those cover crop benefits compared to your cereals and your legumes. Now, it's not a bad idea to include a brassica in your mix, and we did see variety differences. So if you do want to include a brassica, I would encourage you to look at those variety test results and determine which of those varieties is going to provide you the maximum number of benefits. Now, in terms of biomass, generally they were below average. We have a few exceptions with our Arifi radish and then Smart and SERWF19, which had above average biomass, but I would say really where the brassicas performed best was in that percent cover. You can see that the majority of them had above average percent cover for November, and then that Viva and the Seralfa radish providing above average percent cover in February as well. So I would say that either of those would be a good option for adding to your cover crop mix. Speaking of brassicas, we did see some location differences for our cover crop variety trial. Now, generally, Milan in West Tennessee and Knoxville in East Tennessee performed pretty similarly in terms of their overall biomass and how those varieties and species ranked. The exception to this was our Middle Tennessee location in Spring Hill. This had the lowest biomass overall of all 3 locations across the entire trial, and specifically we saw some differences in species performance, particularly our brassicas and our crimson clovers. So at our Spring Hill location, our brassicas did very poorly. So you can see here at the bottom, one of our top performing brassica species in Knoxville in February. You can see a pretty good percent cover there, quite a bit of biomass, and compare that to that same variety in Spring Hill where you can barely even see the plants. I'm not sure there are even any plants on that plot. Most of it had winter killed at that point. So very important to look at some of those location-specific variety performance when you're determining which varieties you want to grow. Another species we saw big differences in across locations was our crimson clover. So in Spring Hill, crimson clover actually performed very well. And you can see up here the Kentucky Pride at the end of April for our early May evaluation for biomass, and then compare that to the Knoxville location, where much poorer stand, a lot less biomass around that same time of year. So again, important to look at some of those location differences. All right, so again, I'd like to reiterate that the full report can be found at search.utcrops.com. That's going to provide even more information so that you can see not only those top performers, but the rest of the list and where things ranked out, as well as look at some of those specific location differences if you're looking for East, Middle, or West Tennessee. Listed here are the companies that contributed seed to our 2019-2020 variety trial. And again, we don't really have enough room here in a PowerPoint presentation to list all 60 varieties and where they came from. So if you're looking for a source for a specific variety, again, I would encourage you to download that full report where you can find which variety is associated with which of these companies, as well as more contact information for each of these companies. So at this point in the presentation, this is where I would typically say, okay, let's stop talking and let you take a look at these plots yourself. And if it were May and not July, and we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, then you would be able to walk through these beautiful plots of cover crops. But since we are in a pandemic and it is July and not May, we're going to take you through a virtual tour of those plots at the East Tennessee location. All right, I'm going to take a minute on this first plot just to set things up. And then after that, I'm not going to talk much, so you can leisurely walk through these plots yourself. Feel free to pause the presentation if you want to take a closer look at any of them. So these pictures are of our first rep, again at our Knoxville location. Here on the sign, you can see which group that fell into, so whether it was a cereal, legume, or brassica, which company that seed came from, the species, and then the variety name. And up here in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see the average across the 3 locations for biomass in April and May, percent cover in November and February, and then height in November, February, April, and May. Then here in the far right, we have our trial average so that you can compare that variety performance to the overall trial and see, okay, did this variety perform above average, below average, or was it kind of on par with the rest of the trial? So with that, I'm going to stop talking and let you walk through the rest of these plots.